Hi, welcome to the Jerusalem Post. I'm Corrine Baum. I'm a breaking news desk editor who has a focus on Russia.
And I'm Winston, the news editor of the Jerusalem Post. So today we're going to be talking about Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
25 years in power, although you and I technically count it from New Year's Eve 1999.
I absolutely would.
So we're going to be looking at his early life, his rise to power a little bit, and then we're going to be focusing on sort of how he has changed how his reputation has changed globally, things that have happened domestically, obviously things that have happened internationally, and how what the state of Russia is today and what the state of Vladimir Putin is today. So
that's all we can talk.
So let's get cracking.
Get cracking.
We're talking obviously about a guy. I think his life story is pretty well known these days. I think so. He grew up in sort of poor conditions in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, for those unaware. And there's a very famous story, I'm sure you know, of the rat
story.
Do you want to share the rat story?
I would love to share the rat story. So like we discussed, Putin was born on October 7th, 1952 in Leningrad. He was from a working class family. And when I've listened to other Russian citizens describe the conditions in which Putin grew up in and his neighbors, deplorable. He tells a story often where he and his friends in his apartment complex used to chase rats around the building and around the neighborhood.
Fun.
Sounds like a great deal of fun. And I guess one day Putin found this massive rat and he starts chasing it around the building. And at one point he corners this rat and the rat just turns at him and stares for the way he describes it, a solid minute. And then it lunges at him. And Putin's kind of left with, he just has to scuttle away. And he often describes this as his first kind of real solid lesson he remembers, where you should never, ever back someone into a wall because you never know what they're going to do. And you never know how they're going to react, which is interesting because when I look at his foreign policy now and when I look at some of the things he's done, I feel like that's not necessarily congruent, but...
Well, those who defend sort of Russia's interests in Ukraine or the actions it has taken would say that this is precisely the point, that NATO, the US, whoever you want to blame for the past 30, 20 years have been slowly but surely pushing Russia into this cornering. And just as the rat, Putin has lunged back and taken the first step. But this story first came out in, I think it was an autobiography or a collection of interviews he did in the early 2000s. So this was sort of, this was a different Putin back then. But it's still a very interesting insight into the mentality of the man. And obviously, we know growing up, pretty much his dream job was always
a KGB
to join the KGB, which he did. Although it's fascinating, obviously, he later on, for a brief time, did rule over the organization.
But it was then the FSB, which is different,
FSB,
but
sure.
yes.
But it's interesting that this guy's sort of dream job was to join the Secret Service.
It is.
And he ended up serving in a not so exotic post in Dresden, East Germany.
He was doing what a lot of people describe as a very necessary job, but ultimately incredibly boring. There's not a lot of prestige with it. It might sound prestigious. He was in counterintelligence. Basically, what that means is he's just connecting things. He's getting jobs done. He's chasing down papers for people. It's not pretty.
It's not James Bond.
It's not James Bond, which is interesting because later on, a lot of Russian political advisors will try and frame him as a Russian James Bond. There's a character, but I'm forgetting the name of the Russian James Bond right now. But yeah, when Putin goes to serve in Dresden with his young family, like I said, he's not doing anything glamorous. And then you kind of have the fall of the Soviet Union. So when...
Well, sorry to interrupt.
No.
I think it's important as well to remember that, as you said, and during this period of the Cold War, Dresden is not some exotic, wonderful, far-off locale that you can be posted to. And, I'm sure if you asked any KGB agent, would they prefer being in Cuba or would they prefer being in Dresden?
They're going to prefer...
There would be only one answer. So Dresden is based in East Germany, which is an independent country, obviously part of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc. It is ruled by the communists. And to be quite frank, I think we can say 30 years after the fall, it's not a particularly nice place. It's not there's no strong economy. It's very reliant on the Soviet Union. And Putin it's often depicted as sort of this grey landscape, concrete, miserable. And this is the world that Putin lives in, as you said, doing a necessary but rather unglamorous function.
It's a brutalist place. It's interesting though, because when you listen to like interviews and stuff with his ex-wife Ludmila and his daughters and like Putin himself, it's unglamorous, but he did seem to like somewhat enjoy. He makes jokes all the time. Like he gained a lot of weight. He had a big taste for German beer, and it was very predictable, very calm. Like there wasn't, like I said, there wasn't anything that exciting about it. And
It seemed a very predictable trajectory, should we say,
Yes.
until
the fall of East Germany, when East Germany decides to unify with West Germany. So on that day, you have a lot of interesting things where basically this mob comes up to the offices Putin's working at. He's the one who's given the order. He has to go outside, and he goes, "I'm just here to let you all know there is a tank behind the gate of the office, and if I am given the order, the tank will shoot. So you can either disperse and get out now, or something else is going to happen." And basically, he has this moment where he manages to kind of get the emotions of the crowd, get what everyone's feeling, and he manages to convince them to leave. Before this, I believe, he called Moscow. He called his superiors and he was like, "Hi, like, what's going on? What are we going to do? I have this mob of people here. Like, can I fire if I need to?" And the superior officer told him the only person who can give the order to fire is Moscow. And Moscow was silent. And
the famous phrase.
Very famous phrase. It's something that you hear a lot when you like read about this period of Putin's life. And it appears to have had a real impact on him. Apparently, this is something, I don't want to call it a wound, but it's something that definitely kind of haunted him, where at a moment where he clearly felt like he needed guidance and he needed support from the state, there was none. And I think it's something that if you're tracking like his later moves after he comes from Dresden, I don't want to say despondent, but like he's directionless. At one point in time, he considers becoming a taxi driver.
Yes, I think there might be some video footage of him maybe in it.
Maybe I'll try and find it.
But it's interesting again to come back to the facing of the crowd, the idea of this rat being cornered and lunging first and acting first, and what it must have meant to him, or how it may have affected him to stand in front of this crowd and say, "Just so you guys are aware, there's a tank behind me." And
it will shoot if it has to, when he doesn't have the authority to shoot the tank. It's very interesting. It also, I think we maybe could have talked about this earlier, but Putin, as a young boy, very slight, B student, wasn't a very remarkable KGB cadet, wasn't a very remarkable student in school. You know, he was average. It's part of his genius. But he also, for a while, he studied boxing. It didn't really work out in his favor because he is at the time, I guess he had very small fists. He's not really he can throw a punch, but not as well as some of the other boys. And he ends up studying judo. And that's another thing that I think you see a lot in his philosophy, where with the philosophy of judo, you're using your opponent's weaknesses to get a leg up and to ultimately be able to win the fight. And I definitely think that you can see that a lot today with like how Putin acts, and you can see it through his history.
Very much so. I think that's an excellent point. Obviously, we've talked about the fall of the Berlin Wall and things that happen in East Germany. Putin then goes back to Russia.
Yes, he does.
And the early 1990s are an incredibly traumatic time for the country. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. Obviously, Russia was the biggest socialist republic within the Soviet Union, and now finds itself alone. Ukraine gains independence. All of these countries, Belarus, Kazakhstan, you can go through the long list. And Russia goes through a terrible economic time. So he goes back to St. Petersburg, and as we just mentioned, taxi driving, looking for these jobs, these odds and ends, trying to make ends meet. And for a former KGB agent who, whilst maybe not necessarily sort of the ultimate believer in communism as an ideology, which many people have discussed, or he was certainly very proud, of where he came from and what he did and who he served. And to suddenly find yourself in a situation where it seems like your country has completely fallen apart politically and economically, it must have been, it must have been quite a shock to his system.
I agree. It's also very interesting when you think about the Russia Putin's returning to. Putin was in East Germany for years. So the Russia he left and the Russia he returned to are two completely different places.
Absolutely.
It's, when he left, you had all the pomp and glory of the Soviet Union. And yes, it wasn't necessarily at its heyday, but like it was obviously
projected, and it's still the image of
yes.
superpower.
The Russia Putin is coming back to is not the Russia that existed when he left. It's two completely different countries, and I definitely think that he feels this when he moves back to St. Petersburg. And like we discussed, he just thinks about becoming a taxi driver. He's down on his luck, for lack of a better word. And in a theme that you will continue to see throughout Putin's career, the KGB disbands with the fall of the Soviet Union. And basically, through a network of officers, Putin is able to get a job at St. Petersburg University. Or I believe it was then Leningrad University. It will later become. This is
a massive turning point in his life. Yes. And it's a concept sort of people know well. It's not what you know, it's who you know.
It is. Putin's career can absolutely be marked with, like, one of the central themes is nepotism, and specifically nepotism with his old KGB buddies. Some of the people he served with in Dresden or throughout the KGB are some of his like top advisors still to this day. And it's incredibly interesting because there is this loyalty and also there isn't, because as we will later see, you know, is everything necessarily out there publicly? No, but there's a lot of belief that he has killed or murdered some of his most like senior associates and advisors. People have a strange illness of falling out of windows or turning on lights and instantly dying in Russia. So
it's a curious illness. It definitely is. So he falls in at the university, as you said, with Anatoly
Sobchak. It's my belief that Anatoly Sobchak is, if you're going to talk about Putin's career in the start, you have to talk about Sobchak. I think he is arguably the most important figure in Putin's like political becoming. So Anatoly Sobchak, for those who don't know, was a law professor at the university that Putin was working at. And he was Putin's law professor, actually. Fun note that when Putin was a schoolboy, he went to the KGB offices and asked, how can I become a KGB officer? They tell him to get the hell out of the offices. He comes back a couple of days later and he's like, okay, great. I'll go to university and do what you want. But like, what do I study to become an officer? And someone's like, law, sure, I guess. So he goes on to study law at Leningrad State University, and then he goes on to study under Anatoly Sobchak. And
again, that, by the way, that's a fascinating insight into the sort of the directness of his mind.
One-track mind.
Exactly.
Like, it's just a one-track mind. So Sobchak is kind of in most ways Putin's opposite. Sobchak was not interested in details. Sobchak he was someone who could just talk and talk for hours. It's something that arguably later got him in a lot of trouble with Putin, actually. And he was really into clothes, like was known for being very vain. And Putin comes on as his second in command, basically, and basically just makes his life easier. And it's also something that you will see in Putin's very early career. Putin is a guy who can make your problems go away. Mm-hmm. He is unremarkable. There's nothing really that remarkable about him, like we said.
He's always there in the background when you see the videos of this time, when you see photographs. He is a very, very bland figure, just sort of, I don't want to say lurking, but lurking in the background. He's there, but he's not, your eyes are not drawn to him. He's not noticeable. He's not, as you say, flamboyant.
He's not a Sobchak.
Mentor.
Yeah.
Exactly.
He's not that charismatic. Also, he was known for this in the KGB too. Like in the KGB, his nickname was the Moth because he was just sort of this gray figure who blended into the wall. And again, that's kind of his genius, which is very strange because I feel like we'll talk about other world leaders and you'll think about like their prestige and their charisma. But he doesn't necessarily get this charisma and this prestige until much later in his career. So like I was saying, with Sobchak later becomes mayor of St. Petersburg.
And this is sort of the beginning of what we could, I guess, term Putin's political career. He's involved in local politics. He works for the mayor. He's
the deputy mayor. And when he kind of becomes involved with Sobchak and his associates, he also starts kind of getting involved more with Russian oligarchs and Russian mafia members. And that's where you can start to begin to see some of these very shady connections start to come about, where later on, after he runs again I think I forget if he runs again for mayor or for the State Duma, but Sobchak.
He runs for mayor in 96 and he loses, and that's when Putin
Yes.
makes the move to Moscow.
Yes, that is. So Sobchak runs again for mayor. He loses, like we discussed. And Putin actually is one of the key people to manage to get Sobchak out of Russia. He's one of the people who is engineering this like escape for Sobchak.
You mentioned, of course, the sort of conditions of the mid-90s. The Russian economy completely collapsed during this point. There was sort of the black market was people's go-to to get items, to get daily items, you know, their food and their whatever they needed for the house. So this, and as you mentioned, the rise of the oligarchs. When the Soviet Union broke down, there was this concept of splitting these companies into shares and selling the shares to people. And, you know, through one means or the other, the oligarchs managed to accumulate sort of
Massive amounts of power.
These companies that had formerly been state companies in gas, in banking, in you name it, they had it. And so this is a world that even just 30 years later is very, very difficult for us to actually comprehend. I remember growing up seeing, you know, photos of bread queues in Moscow and things like that in the mid-90s. But obviously I was a child and I didn't completely understand what on earth was going on. But this was just such a traumatic time for the nation, for the people. And Putin, as we said, has gone from being sort of an esteemed and unremarkable, but he was a member of the KGB, which was, you know, a terrifying organization. And suddenly the country is just in absolute turmoil. He makes these connections. He's fallen in with Sobchak, and it's a great lever for him. It's
a great way to get his way up, actually. So one of the most interesting things, like you discussed, Alex, where a lot of the power or business power, financial power in Russia goes to like this very, very small group of people. I think it's like 9 people, something like this. And Putin really kind of gets his way in with them, like I said, by making their problems disappear, by like kind of sidelining these corruption cases and making sure that like, oh, if this person, for example, has an investigation open into him, such as Sobchak, it goes away. Oh, he's going to Paris. He's just going to go chill and live on the Seine, whatever. But at one point in time, he becomes the head of the Committee for External Relations, which is where we can really see his connections with what are later to be known as the Tambovskaya kind of solidify. Later on, we then see Putin start to move into like greater politics. And what's really interesting, in the same line as Sobchak, when he starts campaigning in 2000 to like actually secure the Russian presidency instead of just inheriting it from a very, very drunk Boris Yeltsin.
Very drunk Boris
Yeltsin. He appoints Sobchak as, there's a specific word for it in Russian, but it basically means someone who campaigned for him the entire time. His job is just to campaign for Putin. And Sobchak gets a lot of heat from Putin when they're on the campaign trail because he compares Putin to a modern-day Stalin, which obviously doesn't go over well. And so he would also he was creating incongruent timelines. It wasn't a good look for Putin, even though Sobchak was a figure who was well known. And Putin basically makes him disappear by demanding that he fly to a lakeside resort to go kind of campaign for him less than 24 hours before he had to leave. And at that, on that trip, the guy turned on a light bulb and he's gone. Mm-hmm. He died the same day. At Sobchak's funeral, it's the last time that you can really see Putin have a significant display of emotion.
He's there with the widow.
Yes, he's there with Sobchak's widow and Sobchak's family. And you see him actually really appearing very depressed. And he gives this whole speech that basically amounts to Anatoly Sobchak died because everyone in Russia was criticizing him. And they backed him into a corner, essentially. And it was because he was persecuted so unjustly and so unfairly, he died. It's so interesting to me, too, because later on, an independent Russian journalist who was also later killed basically discovered that Sobchak's 2 bodyguards were treated at a hospital in the region for mild contact poisoning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a theme that crops up again and again.
It's again and again. You're gonna hear it through everything. It happens with journalists. It happens with political opposition candidates such as Alexei Navalny. It happens with minor level bureaucrats who just.
But this guy, we were talking a few minutes ago about the mid 1990s.
Yes.
And in 96 he moves to Moscow. And
Yes.
you said sort of 2000 when he's campaigning in this presidential election in March 2000. I mean, to go from the mid-90s to be working, for the St. Petersburg mayor who loses his election campaign or re-election campaign in 1996 to president of the country,
Yes.
that's an insane rise. Even as far as revolutions go, that's a crazy
It is.
meteoric rise in the space of 3 years. How does this happen?
So basically what happens, at a certain point, Putin becomes head of the FSB, the successor to the KGB. One thing that's really interesting about this is, as we've mentioned, at worst, the KGB were something to be absolutely feared in Russia. At best, you were a KGB agent, I guess. And so former KGB officers and agents, to my understanding, had a sense that they had lost their prestige and that they weren't respected by the public. They weren't liked by the public. And Putin, when he becomes head of the FSB, basically gets on this campaign where they're going to take it back and they're going to get back their respect and they're going to earn the trust back of the Russian people. He also does this by, again, making a lot of people's problems go away and stuff like this. Eventually, he comes into contact with Boris Yeltsin. And what's really interesting about kind of how he comes to power with Yeltsin is he's basically chosen by some of Yeltsin's closest friends and his family, who know that the first president of Russia is just not going to last for life.
Well, Yeltsin, for those of our maybe younger viewers and listeners, Yeltsin was the last leader of the Russian Soviet Republic, and like many of the Soviet republics, when they gained independence, there was a sort of natural transition that they carried on as leader. He was involved, obviously, heavily in the breakup of the Soviet Union as the leader of the most powerful and the biggest of the republics. And then he continued throughout the 1990s. He oversaw, obviously, we mentioned this economic collapse. He oversaw a couple of sort of rebellions. And famously so, he was an absolute drunk. He danced naked on the White House during a visit to the US. He, I think, once was too drunk when he landed in Dublin to get off the plane and meet the Irish president because he was so imbued with vodka. And so this is a man who is in poor health. He's getting on. He's been around politics for a long, long, long time through the Soviet period. And Putin, as you say, is sort of announced. In 1999, he becomes the prime minister.
Yes. So in 1999, basically before the infamous New Year's Eve speech in which Yeltsin officially resigns the presidency, and Putin then kind of comes on immediately is like...
And we should point out, by the way, that the prime minister in Russia is secondary to the president. Unlike here in Israel or other such countries, the president is the ruling authority.
It is very... I would say, like, you could draw a pretty good parallel between the president of Israel versus the prime minister of Russia. It is largely, yes, you do things, but it's not, and especially now, absolutely does not hold the same weight as the leader of the country. But he was picked by Sobchak's family and stuff because he had this ability to make things go away. He was Yeltsin also infamously kind of did associate with the Tambovskaya and with the oligarchs. And it's very interesting because I've heard accounts from journalists who were working with Yeltsin's chief of staff in the summer of 1999, so almost 6 months before Putin would officially kind of take the helm. And they were discussing who his predecessor could be. And they went through a bunch of kind of natural candidates for the presidency. And at the end of the conversation, the chief of staff turned to the journalist who would later end up writing Putin's official biography for the Kremlin when he was trying to make himself known. And he told her, he goes, "You need to watch Putin." And she goes, "What do you mean? This man is unelectable. He's not cute. He's a bureaucrat. He has next to no political experience other than in local politics. And he's not charismatic. Why would I watch this gray figure standing in the corner?" And then, of course, we know little a little after, Yeltsin resigns the presidency and Putin takes the helm. And in his first New Year's address to the country, Alex, you don't speak Russian, but...
Not fluently.
No. As a Russian speaker, I'm not the most fluent either, but to my understanding, he is so wooden and so awkward. It's so interesting to me to see the contrast between this Putin who is just kind of holding himself like this and is trying to get people to like him versus the Putin we know now, who is seen as this larger than life figure that's almost mythological in a sense. And so in this address, what's also very interesting is to see kind of the contrast between what he says at the turn of the century versus what he says 25 years later, a quarter way in. And Putin starts his address by basically wishing Yeltsin health and saying that he's going to ensure that there's no vacuum of power because he understands this is important to the Russian people. And he also goes on to say that freedom is of the utmost importance to the Russian Federation. Freedom of media, freedom of speech, freedom, I don't believe he mentions freedom of religion, but he goes on to say he wants closer relations with the West. And he
was very Western orientated at the beginning.
Yes, very Western orientated. One of his first actions as president was to call the Secretary General of NATO and invite him to Russia to effectively bury the hatchet, solve their problems.
And this is such an important point sort of to bring up is that yes, he was unremarkable, but I think at this period, whoever took over Russia, there was a hope of more integration, of more, not Western looking, but sort of, you've got to remember, the period of the time in the summer of 2000, George W. Bush is elected U.S. president, taking over from Bill Clinton. That changes. There's the handover of an era. Tony Blair in the UK is 3 years into his premiership. So there was this sort of looking forward, should we say, into the 21st century. And there was hope for Russia at this period, that it could move forward, it could recover from its economic troubles, from its communist past, and it could, literally, like we said, finally move into the 21st century and become a healthy modern state. And in these early years of his presidency, Putin kind of epitomized this. George W. Bush famously said,
I met the soul of his mate.
When they were at the ranch, he looked into his eyes and saw his soul, or to paraphrase. And
absolutely.
And Blair was also very, very, very positive about Putin. So there was real hope. And then obviously there are domestic issues, which through his security experience, he manages to shift the situation into the direction he wants to take it, such as the issue with Chechnya. Yes,
this is a very interesting issue to me personally, because I feel like you can see the beginnings of what you are currently seeing in Ukraine, in Chechnya. So for those who don't know, Chechnya at the time was a separatist region. It is in southern...
It's within Russia.
It is within Russia currently now. It is in southern Russia, and it is majority, I believe, or has a significant Muslim population. And they are an ethnic minority in Russia. The first Chechen War during Yeltsin's term was considered a massive blunder because Russian forces had to withdraw. And then over kind of at the end of that, and right before the beginning, you had a significant series of terrorist attacks in Russia. You had a couple of apartment bombings in Moscow and in St. Petersburg that Putin basically takes as an opportunity to become a strong man, like a strongman politician, and go, no, absolutely not. We are going back into Chechnya, and
we're going to crush these rebels. We're going to keep control.
Yes.
But there is a caveat to this, to these apartment bombings.
Yes. So the caveat to the apartment bombing is infamously, basically, I believe this one is in southern Russia, if I'm not mistaken. But there's an apartment bombing, and it's discovered by residents of the building. The residents of the building discover explosive materials in the basement. They report it to the FSB. It's all taken care of. Yay, like an attack foil.
And the Russians projected this as we foiled another Chechen terrorist attack.
Absolutely. What later comes out is that several FSB officers are detained months later. And then it starts coming out that the residents of the building caught FSB agents planting explosives in the basement of the building. And then it's kind of very quickly, it goes murky very fast. Everything goes it's very unclear what happens. But I believe what ends up happening is the FSB comes out and is like, everyone, it was a training exercise. We were
trying to cover their tracks, basically,
Yes,
and
they're
say,
trying.
actually, no, we were just practicing because of our experience with these Chechen apartment bombings. And everybody's sort of sat there going, are you sure?
Exactly.
Is this kosher?
Exactly. And then you'll find that later several Russian journalists investigate the event and find that like several different pieces of like direct contact with like higher up officers in the FSB who Putin would have known. Several of those journalists have also fallen out windows or been poisoned. And it's a very strange, mysterious illness, and it's very interesting to watch. But the other thing about Chechnya, Russian forces go into Chechnya and absolutely decimate the place. You can see footage where the infrastructure in Chechnya, everything is wiped.
It's obliterated.
It's completely obliterated.
Destroyed.
Completely obliterated. There's a lot of reports of Russian forces acting completely against international laws and international laws of war. They basically obliterate the place under Putin's guise, but this is also, bear in mind, around the start of like the war on terror, George Bush's war on terror. It's just a couple of years before.
Putin is seen as an ally, by the way. Putin is seen, because obviously, as you mentioned, in Chechnya, it's a majority Muslim place, and they believe that they want their own country. They don't want to be a part of Russia. They were conquered 200 years ago by the Russian Empire. They're not ethnically Russian people, and 9/11 sort of changes the international picture. And Bush sees Putin is on their side. Putin, Blair, the West, basically. Putin is with the West in this war against terror, and that's kind of why the West not turns a blind eye, but it's kind of willing to let him deal with the Chechen problem as it is. But he also, I mean, it's a very interesting, as you mentioned, sort of this strongman image, the beginning of the strongman image. He also has to deal with domestic terror along these separatist lines. He has to deal with school hostage taking, where the security services again come under criticism for their heavy-handedness with theater sieges in Moscow. And sort of within a few years, he's gone from being this meek and timid background guy to being, I'm the protector of Russians and I will keep this country safe and intact and use whatever force is necessary as well.
Yes. And it's interesting because I will use whatever force is necessary. I am here for Russia, but also not necessarily to protect Russia, but in order to advance Russia, we must become European. We must become Western. And this is something that you really see, like we said early in his career, where like he was considered a strong ally by George Bush. He was reportedly the first world leader to call President Bush after 9/11. He offered, when Bush decided to invade Afghanistan, he reportedly offered Bush like military assistance in the region and offered to let them use bases, which makes Bush's job much easier. So it's incredibly interesting for me to see like this progression versus his relationship with former President Obama, where two very, very different worlds at the time. And granted, then at the start of Obama's term, that would have been the start of Medvedev's term. So that is a little bit different. But
well, we can get onto that now.
Yeah.
So Putin is re-elected in 2004 with 71% of the vote. I don't want to comment on how legitimate that is because back then it could have been fair and square.
Yes.
But he's clearly very, very popular and he has these extra years. So by 2008, when Obama is elected, we have 8 years of Vladimir Putin. The world knows that he's Russia's leader. We've seen how he responds to domestic terrorism, how he responds to wars, his relations with the West. And had he, as you mentioned, because there were term limits in Russia, he handed over power to his deputy from 2008 to 2012, Dmitry Medvedev.
Yes. Medvedev.
And that was a point at which Putin, in theory, could have ridden off into the sunset and the world would have remembered him, I think, on the whole, as a positive leader for Russia, somebody who brought Russia into the 21st century.
Yes, he brought them away from the Soviet Union, was clearly making efforts to westernize them. There are some reports that like he kind of had a button where it's like, you know, he could be super pragmatic, super down to earth with Western leaders. And then they would say one thing about the Chechen war and he would kind of snap on a dime. So there are kind of beginnings of like a sort of incongruency, if you will. But on the whole, I agree with you. In 2008, he could have walked away. He was relatively popular. Like, I remember in his first term, he received some like 53% of the vote after the way he handled the Chechnya like situation. He wasn't doing poorly. Internally, there were definitely some things with how he was handling the oligarchs and how he was handling mass media, which is yet again something you can see throughout his career. The way that Putin handles information as a sense of power is a hallmark, I personally believe. But I agree with you. In 2008, if he hands over power to Medvedev, he could have faded into the background once again. And I don't think outside of Russia, you would have heard that much more. But that doesn't happen.
It doesn't, unfortunately. For 4 years, he's the prime minister, which, as we mentioned, is a sort of a rather unceremonious role in Russia. But everybody knows basically that behind the scenes, he's pulling the strings. He's in charge still. And then in 2012, because of the way the Russian constitution works and the presidential laws, he could come back for more terms.
So what is also interesting, in 2012, Putin takes office once again. I don't remember the percentage of the vote, but this is where it kind of starts to get interesting. Putin basically amends the Russian constitution to say that no one Russian president can serve for more than 2 6-year terms. Previously, it was 4. Now it's 6.
So that would take him through to 2018.
Yes. And then later on, I believe in 2024, he amends it once again to say that he is in power because I think he blamed it on the situation in Ukraine, but I'm not 100% sure. But basically in 2024, he amends it once again to say, oh, no, I can stay until 2036, when he would be 84 years old and reasonably like kind of at the brink of like, all right, it's time to move on, or time to go to retire and live in your dacha and be happy. But yeah, so I believe that when he starts amending the Constitution is when we can officially start marking him as an autocrat. It's not that there weren't signs before. It's not that there weren't definite markings of foul play and nepotism and relations with shady political characters, because there always were. But it's when you can officially go, oh, hold on a second, this is where it's going to get weird. 2012 is also where you see the Russian Foreign Agents Act come in, or bill. Basically, a foreign agent in Russian, or inoagent, is someone who the Russian Federation believes has assistance from a country outside of Russia to promote a Western narrative or other ideals within the country. So 2012 is also when you see a lot of crackdown on civil rights groups. Like, so infamously, I don't know if it's called the Protecting Families Act, but the law in Russia that says that LGBTQ propaganda is no longer allowed within the state of Russia. So it's when you're going to see a massive crackdown on that and a massive crackdown on mass media, like we said.
Yes.
So a lot of foreign agents, a lot of media starts basically getting marked as foreign agents. And
it's a huge crackdown as well.
Huge. It's brutal. So like multiple like infamous TV stations and infamous independent Russian news sources that are not owned by the state or owned by oligarchs, because it's also very important to know that this was before 2012, but at the start of the century, Russian oligarchs owned a vast majority, if not all, of Russian media.
Yes.
You can have your opinions on that. There's definitely something to be said. But it was also, to a certain extent, independent. And I have heard...
They were allowed to criticize Putin.
They were allowed to criticize Putin. They were allowed to criticize the Kremlin. And you will also hear stories of young Russian journalists being incredibly optimistic because they were working in a profession where it was very young. There were editors-in-chiefs of newspaper who were 35 at the max. And they were earning up to 5 times more than their parents in respectable kind of run-of-the-mill jobs, because these oligarchs they really needed journalists. And then this kind of all changes in 2012. And then later on, as we will see kind of as we move over into the 2020s, Putin starts cracking down on more and more and more.
It's a crackdown basically on domestic freedoms, should we say,
Absolutely.
on the media, on these different sort of groups, as you said, LGBTQ or I can't think of any other one.
I'm sure that you would also like kind of start to see probably like crackdowns on like ethnic minorities, I believe as well.
And journalists as well, like you mentioned,
Yes.
by the way, this hope sort of under the oligarchs, or this hope anyway for young journalists. Journalists are come under for some severe treatment,
Yes.
and worse in Russia through
Absolutely.
the 2010s. It's a dangerous profession to be independent minded. I mean, as one of the hallmarks of the last decade, really, of Putin's rule has been sort of the circus that is watching Russian state media, watching the news shows, watching the TV shows, the chat shows, and the farce that it has become in parroting whatever it is the Kremlin wants them to parrot, but also the act that they put on, this dramatic act where they're trying to, they almost try and pretend that they are still independent and they can debate these things, but the world knows that basically it's a farce.
And I believe in 2012 is when the world starts to wake up and go, oh, hold on a second. No independent, democratic nation that has the history that Russia has, let's add, would do this.
It's important to point out as well, as you said, the history Russia has had. Russia has never had really a truly independent, because obviously, as we said, the fall of communism created such confusion and such chaos, a truly independently elected, democratically elected ruler in its history, which is a crazy thing to talk about. You're talking about the biggest country in the world, a superpower. It has one of the largest populations in the world. It has huge natural resources of gas and minerals and oil, and yet has, as we said, never truly had an independently, democratically elected leader.
No, and you have different analysts and different Russian journalists, think tanks who will argue that, and I kind of vehemently disagree, that Russia just can't handle one. I think that now, and this is kind of us getting into the effect of Putin and effectively like moving into that area of the conversation. I believe that now, with the damage that has been wrought from Putin's tenure as Russian president, it is because if you think of Russia, because it's the world's largest landmass, in like essentially 4 zones, so you have like Moscow and Petersburg, and then it kind of starts going out. If you're all the way out in Yakutsk, your only information is state television. So what else are you going to believe?
Exactly.
It's very hard to be independent-minded if you're in such a barren place where information doesn't get there. Because Russia has also shut off hundreds of thousands of news sites. They've shut off hundreds of like websites with
social media,
massive crackdown. It's hard to know other information. So how can you get introduced to other ideas?
So, Corrine, you said
Yes.
that, in your opinion, 2012 domestically was a massive, massive turning point.
Yes.
And I think 2014 can be pointed out internationally as a massive turning point.
I agree.
In terms of, I don't want to use the word appeasement, but it's the major word that springs to my mind.
Yes.
That when Russians basically rolled into Crimea, southern Ukraine, and basically there was not a murmur. There was not a murmur. Domestically, obviously, the Ukrainians were very, very unhappy, but internationally, nobody put up much of a fight.
No, and I also, granted, I was much younger, so I don't really remember this, but I know that they invaded Georgia in 2008 as well. Do you remember any sort of...
I remember this was a similar situation where Russia claims that, now that they claim part of Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine, no, they all want to be Russians. They feel more Russian. They would like to be part of Russia. So it was a similar thing in Georgia, with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, North Abkhazia, where the Russians basically said, no, these people actually want to be a part of Russia. They don't want to be a part of Georgia. And Russia, under Putin, has also infamously sort of been sticking its nose into Ukrainian affairs for a long time now.
Yes.
For the past 20 years, there's been a couple of revolutions. Former Ukrainian president obviously fled to Russia after he was overthrown, and now lives in Moscow. And so there has always been this relationship between the two countries. But Crimea was a major turning point.
Yes. Well, it's also interesting because Crimea is a major turning point where basically, for those who do not know, Ukraine allowed I believe this is under Petroshenko or something like this, Ukraine allowed Russia to park its Black Sea naval fleet in Crimea. And because there's already like, sure, a military presence, quote unquote, there, but it's Russian servicemen on the boat, so no one necessarily thinks anything of it. But Ukrainians keep warning, like, we're seeing more people. Hey, we're seeing more people. Hey, we're seeing even more people. And then they effectively just walk into Crimea, and then they hold fake elections and claim that this governor of Crimea actually wants to be Russian and wants to join Russia. And it's a complete farce. And it's incredibly interesting to me that, like, no one does much.
I think the worst, from memory, the worst that happens is sort of he's sidelined, a G8 conference, and he's not part of the group photo, and everybody's a bit whatever. But in terms of major international reaction, there's very little beyond financial implications. There's no sort of military response. Nobody really stands up to him. Lessons from history, you learn that somebody takes one piece of land, there's only one thing that they're going to do afterwards. And we saw this in February 2022 with what Mr. Putin described as a special military mission.
Yes.
He refused to call it a war or an invasion, but
to this day.
Well, the facts on the ground, certainly in my mind, are one sovereign nation invaded another sovereign nation.
Yes.
On European soil, by the way. I was talking to someone recently, and this is such an important point that I think people forget, is that when it happens in Southeast Asia, or it happens in South America, or, in the Middle East even, it's a different mentality. When it happens on mainland European soil, it basically harkens the world back to World War II and what people went through then. And I don't think anybody's interested in that. But that's why there has been such a strong response to the invasion of Ukraine. And President Biden especially was phenomenally strong, supporting Zelensky and staying on this point. But Putin has just taken, metaphorically and physically, no prisoners since then. He has done what he wants.
Well, he's taken a lot of prisoners, actually, if you wanna, he's taken no prisoners in that sense. But he also has quite literally taken Ukrainian children from their beds and claimed them as Russian and claimed that they want to be Russian. And now you see President Trump sort of trying to get them back. And I don't necessarily know the details on it because it's been kept pretty well under wraps. But I think another couple of very interesting points about the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. I want to be abundantly clear, and we both have, I believe. But with the invasion of Ukraine, I think it's important for our listeners and our viewers to understand that Putin, for a while, has had this opinion. Ukraine has always kind of been something like he has always meddled in Ukrainian affairs. It's not. This isn't anything new, like you mentioned. But he released an article, I forget in which newspaper it ran, but he released an article where basically he made this entire argument outlining how, no, Ukraine and Russia actually have shared histories, and their history is our history. And, Kiev was never really Kiev, and it was always Russian, and we've always had such close relations, which is why it's like, so hurtful that they want to be independent. Obviously, President Volodymyr Zelensky is like, this is bull.
Well, people have always pointed out that Putin has, in a way, tried to recreate the environment of the Soviet Union. Yes. He's obviously very, very, very close with the Belarusian leader, and obviously his designs on Ukraine. He's had good relations or strong relations with the Central Asian republics during his time in power. And it's always interesting that Putin never, ever promises the Russian people anything to do with the future. Anytime he speaks, it's always, and this article that you mentioned, it's always to do with the past. Yes. He's always looking back, reminding them of Russia's former glory, reminding them of better times. Nothing is a promise. He doesn't say, I'm going to make your lives better by X, Y. He always looks back and says, things were much better back then. We were much stronger back then. Let's go back to then. And whilst maybe not trying to reintroduce the Soviet Union as a political concept, like under communism, a lot of political analysts believe that he has this design to territorially recreate the same thing with him at the helm.
Absolutely. I think you can absolutely see that with this article that he's written. You can also see it in his for those who don't know, the Russian president always gives an address on Novy God, on the New Year. It is to draw a parallel similar to the State of the Union in the United States. It's where the Russian president is going to stand up and say, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going to go, I wish health to all Russians, stuff like that. And in the one for 2025, I believe, he did talk about the future, but he talked about the future in terms of the past. But basically, when he's talking about the future in terms of the past, it's, well, I believe that like we were all stronger together. You were right. And you see that now where Russian forces have effectively taken about a fifth, 25% maybe, a quarter, more or less, of Ukrainian land. Do we necessarily know what's going to happen in terms of a peace treaty with that? No, but it is very much believed by a lot of the Russian journalists. I read the independent Russian journalists, I would like to say. Putin's not going to just give them up.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
If we've learned anything from this man's 25 years in power, and one thing I'd very, very briefly like to touch upon before we finish is his own self, his own vision of himself, his own self-image, and how that has changed. As we said in the beginning, he was this sort of grey, bland guy in the background, and now we have a man who wants to be, or maybe 10 years ago, he wanted to be photographed topless,
yes,
riding horses, wrestling bears, Botox, surgery. These things have all come into play, and it just shows the mentality of how once upon a time this guy was a happy secret agent working in the background in the shadows, that he has developed such a mentality of being in the limelight. It has affected his own self-image and how he portrays himself. And to watch this transformation over 25 years, it's changed the world, quite frankly.
So back in his early career, he once said that his favorite leader was Napoleon Bonaparte. I feel like that, in all honesty, speaks for itself. If you look at the way in which he has taken land, the way that he has usurped power in Russia and absolutely centralized it, where it's not even that the presidency, it is him who can decide the power. You can call it the presidency, but we all know what this is. At the end of the day, being at the helm of the world's largest landmass has affected this man so much that I don't think that there is a world in which Putin sees himself as inseparable from Russia. It is not Russia, it is Putin's Russia. And he wants you to believe that.
He's the new Tsar.
He is the new Tsar, effectively. There's a new sheriff in town. So.
Well, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed listening to Corrine and myself. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to be in touch. You can follow us on Twitter @Jerusalem Post, or you can check us out at jpost.com. Thank you.
Thank you.